All right, here we are. Okay, so thank you everyone for joining us for tonight's lecture. My name is Katie Zimmerman from Lake Johnson Park, and I will be your host for the evening. As a friendly reminder, this lecture will be recorded, so if you do not wish to appear on the recording, please turn your camera off. To reduce feedback, everyone was muted upon entrance. If you have questions during the presentation, please utilize the chat feature, and I will read those questions out as appropriate, but please know there will be time for a Q&A at the end of the lecture as well. And with that, I'll pass it along to you.
Sounds great. Thanks so much, Katie. And thanks so much for everyone who's taken the time out of their evenings on a Monday night to join for the lecture tonight. It's good to have you all here, and hopefully I can share a little bit about the pond management work that I think about at NC State, and maybe get you interested and excited in participating in pond fishing or, some other related activity in some way. So my name is Nadia Mamuzadeh. I'm an assistant professor at North Carolina State University. I am in the Department of Applied Ecology at NC State. And so I'm a faculty member. I teach classes. I run a fisheries genetics lab. I mentor students. But I also, as part of my role at NC State University, I also work with the North Carolina Cooperative Extension, which is a big program at North Carolina State University as a land grant university. And I'll talk a little bit about that in my first few slides here as well. So I'm going to be talking about managing warm water ponds for healthy waters and happy fish. So hopefully I have some pond or fish enthusiasts in the room tonight, because that's what we'll be focusing on. But first, as promised, I just wanted to share a little bit about what NC State Extension is, because most folks I interact with haven't heard of extension programming, and they actually offer a lot of really fantastic resources that are mostly free or low cost to the public. And so I just wanted to share a little bit about that here. As a land grant institution, North Carolina State University provides services to the North Carolina public through its extension program. We actually have an extension office in every single county of North Carolina, and those are shown here in the red, so you can see where those red dots are. And I'm guessing I have some folks in the room from Wake County, but every other county across North Carolina has an extension center as well, which means they also have extension staff and extension programming. And that programming can focus on anything from how to garden in this warm summer, warm climate that we have here in North Carolina, all the way through to ag, blueberry production, Christmas tree production, a lot of the ag industries that are important here to North Carolina, and many, many topics in between. So you can see here we are at the NC State campus in the star here. And I would just encourage you to check out the NC State Extension website. There's lots of really fun programmings, master gardening, how to build a pollinator garden. There's just all kinds of examples of what we do through NC State Extension. So we have an extension office in each county of North Carolina. We have over 1,300 people who participate in extension in some way, including me. We offer tons of educational outreach activities, over 170,000 activities. And, the state of North Carolina, I think, really benefits from having the extension program here. And so, yeah, I would just encourage anyone in the room that's interested to just check out the website and see if there's any programming there you might be interested in participating in. And so, as I mentioned, my background is really in fish and fisheries. And believe it or not, there's also extension programming that focuses on fish. And so that's what I'm here to chat with you a little bit about today, particularly in the context of ponds and pond management. So some of you in the room might have a pond on your property, or you might know someone who has a pond on your property, or you might have access to a public pond that you're interested in maybe using for angling. So I'm just going to jump right into what it looks like to manage a pond, and maybe this will come in handy now or in the future for some of the folks in the room. So I wanted to kick this off by first just talking about really developing a clear goal for your pond. Really, the question that lies at the heart of anything you do for managing your pond is what's the purpose of your pond? And we can use ponds in many different ways. The three primary ways that we might use a pond are shown here on the slide. It could be a pond that's used for stormwater management, which is becoming increasingly important here in North Carolina and elsewhere across the country as we experience more intense rain events. Where does all that runoff water go? We might also use a pond for agriculture, and that could serve roles in irrigation for crops or providing a water source for animals. And then one of the third main areas that a pond might function in is as recreation. So that could be for aesthetics, just wanting a nice looking body of water on your property. Maybe you've got some really pretty vegetation around it with a fountain. It's also possible that you want to use your pond for swimming or primarily for fishing. Regardless of the particular purpose, it's really important from the outset that you understand that purpose because the way you manage your pond is going to look very different for stormwater compared to recreational management for fishing. So, my talk is really going to focus on this area right here, managing a recreational pond, particularly to emphasize fishing opportunities. So that's where I'm going to focus on for the rest of this talk. But I will just say too that the North Carolina Extension has lots of resources available for pond management, including in non-fishing contexts as well. So I would encourage anyone in the room that's really interested in another application of pond management to check out those resources. And I'll just say too that many of the pond owners in North Carolina, aside from our farm owners and managers and workers, um, often might be reaching out to us with their pond management inquiries because they inherited a pond, with inherited property, or they just bought a property that has a pond. So all of the information I'm about to share tonight is hopefully relevant to folks that might fit in that category. Okay, so after you've identified the main purpose of your pond, the next step is to build it right. So this is for folks who are either constructing a pond brand new or maybe modifying and improving an existing pond so that it's structured in a much better way. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this. This is not necessarily an area that I have deep expertise in, but I did want to share just a broad brush overview to kind of point you in the right direction for exploring other resources. So, proper pond construction, as you might guess, is really essential to the success of the pond. There's an entire field and there's a whole private industry that's built around pond planning in construction. And I've just given an example here, a screenshot from a USDA guide that is a little bit older, but it still contains really good, useful, relevant information around pond planning, design, and construction. There's really just a handful of key features that a recreational pond and really any pond should have. Some type of water control structure. Here I'm showing a pipe with a cover on it that allows for drainage of a pond. If you get a rain event with lots of rain coming in, like we've had over the last few days, just cleared up this afternoon here in Wake County, North Carolina, you're going to start to see a lot more runoff into your pond. So what do you do when you have excessive water running into your pond? It's really important that you have a good water control structure in place so that you can drain some of that pond away from the pond itself. You're probably also going to have a trash rack on that structure. If you've ever looked at a pond and seen kind of a big grate sticking out of it and wondered what that was, it's probably a trash rack where it really does, just as the name describes. It keeps trash from getting stuck or small animals from getting stuck in a drainage pipe from the pond. Because it can be expensive to clear those if a clog happens. And also, another important feature is an emergency spillway in case you do have a pond that overflows with water and it's not able to drain fast enough. There needs to be an area that excess water can spill to. Some other key features of a well-constructed pond. I'm just going to run through this list really quickly and talk about what this might look like. So If you're thinking about a pond for fishing opportunities for your recreational angling and fun, really ideally you'd have a pond that's larger than 1 acre in size. And this is really because the pond needs to be large enough to support a community of predator and prey fish species, as well as food for that food web that you're going to be supporting to allow your fish to survive in your pond. In addition to that, we're looking for ponds that have an average depth of about 6 to 8 feet and a max depth of no more than 12 feet. And this is because if a pond is too shallow, if you think about that water, you're going to get sunlight that reaches all the way to the bottom of the pond. And this can be a challenge because it's going to encourage a lot of aquatic vegetation to grow. And this can be really difficult for a pond. It will cause it to fill in with vegetation, and that might make it really difficult to house a healthy fish community. You also really want to make sure that if you're building a new pond, your dam is very well constructed. So here you can see a pond with our trash rack that I mentioned on the previous slide. And here's a dam that's wide enough to support what looks like a vehicle that's driven through here. A well-constructed dam is really needed to prevent leaks over time. A leaky dam is a call that we get frequently here at NC State Extension. A well-constructed dam will have a core inside of it that's made of clay or some other material that's waterproof or water resistant and will allow that to structure to hold in water over a long period of time. Ideally, a pond has a vegetated shoreline. Um, in this picture here, the dam itself is clear, but you can see the rest of the shoreline areas have vegetation growing around it. And this is really important for controlling sedimentation, sediment runoff, soil, silt, and clay runoff into the pond, which can gradually fill it in over time. The thing that you don't really want to have, though, are trees or shrubs or other really rooty vegetation growing on the dam itself, because that can penetrate that waterproof core and cause the dam to become leaky over time. And then, of course, we're thinking about a pond for fishing, right? So, if you are constructing a new pond or thinking about reshaping your pond in some way, an existing pond, then having banks that are really easily accessible so that you can get close to the water and cast from the pond edge really easily and have a good shot at getting fish is also important as well. So that's really all I'm going to say about pond construction because I think maybe we'll have more fun in the room if we can talk a little bit more about what we're going to do next, which is if you build your pond right, then step two is to stock it right and really set yourself up for having some really nice time on your pond. And, maybe your pond can become a fun hub for family events and friends to come over and gather. And this photo here is of a pond that's on an NC State property out past Durham in Durham County, and we have a couple pond fishing events there over the course of the year, and it's just a really fun time. I didn't grow up pond fishing, but I have had the opportunity to experience some really well stocked, really well maintained fishing ponds, and it really is a lot of fun. Okay, so how do we stock it right? Well, we're going to start by picking the right species. And I don't know if I have any anglers in the room here or people who are just really interested in the fish native to here in North Carolina and the Southeast, broadly speaking. But in our warm water ponds, which we're most likely to have here in the Piedmont and coastal areas of North Carolina, as well as, much of the mountain areas, a classic warm water fish assemblage in those ponds consists of the species shown here. So I'll just walk us through some of these species here. If I had a rowdy crowd, I'd ask for anyone to shout out if they recognize any of the species on the slide here. Do I have
You
any
can
takers?
throw it in the chat if you don't want to say it out loud. I would love to see some guesses. I'll go ahead and throw out that I think I see a catfish on the bottom
That's
right.
right. That's right, Katie. That is a catfish on the bottom right.
Anyone else got some guesses you want to shout out loud or throw in the chat?
Catfish was the only one I know from those photos.
You can see those barbels here, which are a dead giveaway of a catfish. It's got that flat head. Yeah. So I'm going to talk about some of these other fish species, but really the classic warm water pond combination are largemouth bass and bluegill. That's a classic combination for warm water ponds, including here in North Carolina. And then you might see a few other species thrown in there as well, including particular species of catfish, which I'll talk about here. So let's learn more about these species. So largemouth
Wait,
bass. Oh,
which one was the
go ahead.
bluegill?
This is the bluegill here.
The
It's a
bottom
really
left?
dark.
Yay! I got
Yeah,
it.
that's.
Okay, thank
Did
you.
you
And
get it?
is that a crappie on the top right?
No, it
Ah,
is a red ear sunfish.
wow. Sunfish was my other guess.
Okay, yep,
Totally.
would have been in the right family. We'll see a crappie later, so maybe you can compare. These little spots here might have been what you were honing in on. Okay, thanks everyone. So largemouth bass, yeah, this species is recognized by its large mouth. You know, this mouth is open, but when the jaw is closed, the back end of the jaw extends past the back end of the eye, and that's how you know it's a largemouth. It has a dark stripe or blotches down the sides. So this is just classic largemouth bass coloration here. Young largemouth bass, they'll feed on zooplankton and insects until they're about 2 inches long. And then they'll start feeding on other fish. They'll even feed on other largemouth bass, but one of their favorite prey items are bluegill. Adult bass will eat mostly fish. They'll eat also large insects, frogs, crayfish, you know, really whatever's around. Um, Most bass will be ready to harvest from your pond once they're 12 inches in size, and it takes them about 2 or 3 years to get to that size. So if you're stocking a pond brand new with largemouth bass, you're going to have to wait. You know, if you're starting with little fish, you're going to have to wait 2 to 3 years until they get big enough for you to harvest them. All right, the other species that we saw on there was a bluegill. So this is me here with the biggest bluegill I've ever caught because normally they're very small. So bluegill, they're also called bream or brim. They're recognizable. They have a really small head, very tiny mouth. If you've ever caught a bluegill and then tried to get the hook out of the mouth, it can be hard to do because the mouth is really small. One of the key ways to distinguish a bluegill is they'll have a dark splotch. I think you can all see my arrow. I'm kind of circling this area of the dorsal fin, the fin on the top side of the fish. At the back base of that fin, you'll see a dark spot, really, and that's just a telltale sign of a bluegill. Sometimes you'll be able to see these vertical dark bands like you can see here, or they might have like a gold color underneath their mouth on their chest. You can kind of see that in this one, but color is not super reliable for distinguishing fish species. Now, bluegill, they also like to eat zooplankton and insects, but they're really lower on the food web than you'd find a largemouth bass. And another key feature of bluegill is they are really fast reproducers. They reproduce quickly and a lot. So that's good because we need a lot of bluegill to feed the largemouth bass in the pond. And bluegill, they'll spawn May through October. Their peak spawning is more so in the spring or early summer, but they will spawn through the summer all the way into the fall. And as I mentioned, but just to emphasize, this is the primary food source for largemouth bass. So we're now talking about our predator and prey dynamics in our little ecosystem, which is our pond. And it's really important that you have both predator and prey in there, our largemouth bass and bluegill, so that they can sustain each other. And the prey for the bluegill are insects. And zooplankton that you'll also hopefully will be abundant in your pond. Okay, some other species that you might stock in your pond. These are less, you know, the base of our fish stocking in these warm water ponds is really going to center around largemouth bass and bluegill. But some people also like having other species in there to catch as well. And here's one of those species. You saw this on the previous slide. It's a red ear sunfish. I think they're really pretty. They're also known as shellcracker. So if you hear someone talk about shellcracker, it's a red ear sunfish. They also have a really small mouth. The body shape might look really similar to the bluegill I had on the last slide, and that's because they're in the same fish family. They're both sunfish, which is a generic name for lots of fish that kind of have the same similar shape and are all closely related to one another. But one key characteristic of a red ear sunfish, as you might guess from the common name there, is this red tab that you'll get on the cheek flap here. And in breeding males, this can be a really bright orange, but that's a really key giveaway of a red ear sunfish. Red ear are mostly a bottom feeder. They'll eat snails and insects. Their growth rate is pretty similar to that of a bluegill, but they can reach slightly larger size, so they can be also fun to catch. And so that's why some people will stock them in their pond as well. But the thing about red ear sunfish is they're not as productive as bluegill. So you really need to have bluegill to provide enough food for the bass, our largemouth bass. If you only have red ear sunfish in there with the bass, those largemouth are just gonna they're just gonna feed on your red ear and they won't be able to reproduce fast enough to keep up with that. So you can add red ear into your pond, but you also want to make sure you're gonna have bluegill in there for your largemouth to feed on. All right, so starting to get us more familiar with our fish species here. And we had a lot of shout outs to this catfish. I'm going to put a name on that catfish. That was actually a channel catfish. So you saw the chin barbels here. But another telltale sign of a channel catfish, because we actually have lots of catfish species here in North Carolina, is you can kind of make them out on the body here, these little speckles. They're not always present on a channel catfish, but if you see them, odds are you have a channel catfish in front of you. They also have a forked tail fin, so you can see that fork here as well. Channel catfish, they're going to eat almost anything. They prefer insects. They tend to hang out on the bottom a little bit more than the other fish species we've talked about. They'll also feed on small fish and crayfish. And they can spawn in ponds. But their eggs will get fed on by both bluegill and small bass. So very few young tend to survive. So you might have to stock them more than one time if you want to have them in your pond. All right, and that's it. I mean, that is our classic warm water pond fish assemblage. So now that we have a sense of which species to stock, the next question is how many of each species to stock. And here at NC State Extension, we've developed these fish stocking tables that folks can use to kind of get a sense of how many fish they might want to purchase from a fish supplier and add to their pond. So the number that you'll want to add, it really depends on the size of your pond. So how much acreage do you have? And whether you're going to stock adult fish or fingerlings. And that term fingerlings, it just refers to our small juvenile fish that might just be a 2 or 3 or maybe 4 inches long. So if we're going to stock those small fish, those fingerlings, then here's our recommended numbers of fish to stock per acre, and it's really in a 1-to-10 ratio of largemouth bass to our sunfish, the bluegill and the red ear sunfish. So for every 100 largemouth, we're going to stock 1,000 bluegill. But if we want some of those bluegill to be red ear sunfish, we can allocate some of that towards red ear sunfish as well. So in this example here, we're going to talk about 700 bluegill, 300 red ear sunfish. And if you wanted to throw in some catfish, you can too. I would recommend 100 individuals. Now, the other thing you might notice here is we have different numbers for a fertilized pond versus an unfertilized pond. So those numbers are going to look a little bit different. So we're going to stock 50 largemouth to about 500 bluegill plus red ear sunfish if our pond is unfertilized. And I'll talk a little bit near the end of this talk what it means to fertilize your pond. But really, when you add fertilizer to your pond, you're putting in nutrients, right? Which means, ideally you have more plankton in the water, more zooplankton, more insects for your bluegill to feed on, which means you can support more bluegill in your system, which also means you can support more largemouth bass in your system. And so that's why in these fertilized ponds, you can stock more fish per acre. The ideal time to stock, I know this says October to November, but actually, yep, that's right. The ideal time to stock your forage fish, our bluegill or our red or sunfish, is in the fall. So right about now is when you'd want to stock those sunfish, bluegill in particular. And then we're going to let those fish grow up through the winter and become established and continue to grow through the spring. And that's when we're going to introduce largemouth bass to the system. Remember, by the time you add those bass to your pond, they need to have something to eat. So you don't want to add them too early. You really want to make sure your prey fish, your forage fish, your bluegill, maybe also red ear sunfish, are doing well and healthy before you introduce largemouth bass. All right, so that stocking table is something that we provide. I just wanted to give you an example of what it looks like if you've decided you don't want to wait 2 to 3 years to harvest your first largemouth bass. You'd prefer to start fishing this year. So let's say in this scenario, you've found a fish supplier that can provide adult fish. It's more expensive to stock adults, but it does mean that you can get fishing faster. And in this case, we're going to use slightly different ratios for stocking our fish here. And it's going to be a 1 to 5 ratio, which is more similar to that unfertilized pond on the previous slide with our little fingerling fish. So what that can look like is stocking 20 largemouth bass to 100 sunfish. You could do 70-30 bluegill to red ear sunfish or 100 bluegill to get that forage base, to have a large enough forage base to sustain your largemouth bass. And again, this is the number of fish per acre. And when you're stocking adults, you can do that all together at the same time. And that's best to happen in April in the spring before the pond gets too warm. And fish, can sometimes get a little more stressed in those warm summer, August months when temperatures can get really high in a pond. Okay, so those are our basic fish stocking formulas, again, for warm water ponds. And it's really up to personal preference. Again, the classic combination in our Piedmont and coastal areas, and maybe even through many parts of the mountain area of North Carolina, it doesn't actually get cold enough to support cold water fish. You might still be looking at a warm water fish assemblage, and you're really going to be looking at bluegill and largemouth bass. Depending on personal preference, you might also have some red ear sunfish and maybe channel catfish in there as well. Okay, so if you've ever fished in a pond before or talked with someone who's thinking about stocking their pond or how to maintain their pond, you might have heard them talking about some other species, here in the Southeast. And one of those species might be a grass carp. So I just wanted to say a few things about some other fish species that could potentially be stocked in a warm water pond here in North Carolina or in the Southeast. So grass carp, this is an herbivorous fish. You can tell carp, to me what always stands out are these really large, almost, they appear diamond shaped. They're not actually diamond shaped, but they look diamond shaped along the body of the fish. They tend to hang out, at the bottom. They're herbivorous fish, and for pond management, they can be stocked for the purpose of controlling unwanted aquatic vegetation. They're very vigorous grass carp. They're very fast growing. But here in North Carolina and elsewhere across the U.S., it's common practice to stock a sterile grass carp because there's always the fear that, especially if you have a pond where if you have a lot of rain coming in, like a big storm comes through, you got a lot of rain coming in, maybe you get some spillover to your pond and that could connect to a neighboring stream. There's always the fear of escapement. And what we really don't want to see happen is a species like carp get out into our native waterways and start competing with our native fish for food. So one way of preventing that is to stock sterile carp, which are known as triploid carp. And this means that they won't be able to reproduce. So you will have to stock them if you want to maintain them over a long period of time, you'll have to keep stocking them. But they can be a really effective biological control agent for some aquatic weed species like hydrilla or alodia or many other aquatic vegetation. But just note there is some aquatic vegetation that grass carp will not help with. So if you have a problem with vegetation that falls in that category, you don't want to invest money in purchasing carp and stocking them into your pond because they're not going to help you out. Um, Really what you want to do if you do have an aquatic weed problem and you're looking at grass carp as a control solution, it's recommended that you stock about 10 to 15 of these fish per acre in a small pond. Um, yeah, and I think that's all I wanted to say about grass carp. Actually, the one thing I will say is you do need a permit to stock grass carp here in North Carolina. So I just wanted to mention that because I think it's really important to be aware of the permitting that's needed to do fish stocking. And I'm realizing I didn't mention this on a previous slide for pond construction. We talked about that very, very briefly. I know that's not the focus of this talk, but just to say there's a whole permitting process that comes with new pond construction. So if you're thinking about going down the route of constructing a new pond, you'll definitely want to make sure to get guidance and support um, from an agency office that is knowledgeable in pond permitting. So now thinking about fish stocking permitting, the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission does require permitting for any type of fish stocking, grass carp or not, in a pond that connects to any other kind of waterway. So if you have a pond that's near and maybe has a connection to a stream, you're going to need a stocking permit from the Wildlife Resources Commission, the WRC. If you're going to stock grass carp, you always need a fish stocking permit. So the guidance from the WRC, I've copied that here. It's really anyone interested in stocking public freshwater, which includes any inland public fishing water or any pond that connects to that water. So even if you have a private pond, if it has a connection to that public water, like a stream, then you're going to need a fish stocking permit. And then if you have a pond that falls in that category, or even if it's totally private, not connected to any other waterway, and you want to stock grass carp, you will always need a stocking permit for that. So um, these permits, I've just put the form here. It's pretty easy to fill out. And that just goes to the Wildlife Resources Commission. If you just Google search fish stocking permit, North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, you're going to come across the link. The guidance is to reach out to your WRC fisheries biologist that's in your district. They've got their names and phone numbers listed there. You can send them this permit, and they'll help you work through that process so that you can get to stock in your pond. All right, some other species that I wanted to mention, we talked about the classic combination of largemouth bass and bluegill in your pond. Maybe if you have an aquatic vegetation issue, you might think about stocking some grass carp. There's some other fish species that have been used in pond stocking in the past, occasionally still in the present, but these species just warrant some additional consideration. Some folks would just say to avoid stocking these species altogether. It's possible, you have for whatever particular purpose or interest, you might have a particular need to stock one of these species. So I thought it worth rephrasing from completely avoid to let's just think about it a little bit more. So we had the guess of crappie on the previous slide there. And, I'm originally from the north and we hear crappie, and you hear both down here too. And I can't remember which is which because now I'm just all confused. I say crappie, I say crappie. But here's a beautiful crappie here. There's two species of crappie, black crappie, white crappie. Both species are found here in North Carolina. They are a really popular game fish. I saw a report the other day. They're actually one of the most commonly targeted recreational freshwater fish species in the United States. So it's a really popular game fish species. So naturally, there might be a lot of interest in stocking crappie in your pond. Um, it is generally recommended to not stock crappie in a warm water fish pond, but I've been to ponds where there's a pretty decent pond balance. We'll talk about pond balance in a few slides here. And that includes with crappie. So, I think it depends on what your personal goals are for your pond. And I mentioned at the beginning, the first question you want to ask yourself about your pond is what's my goal for the pond? What's the pond's purpose? And that's going to define your entire management plan for that pond. Um, and so I think that can come into play here too. A risk of stocking crappie in your pond is that they tend to prey on young bass, young largemouth bass. So it might really limit, you getting nice, big, really fun to catch largemouth bass in your pond. The other challenge with crappie is that they will compete with largemouth bass for food. Um, so, you know, uh, it can throw off the dynamics of your pond community and prevent enough food from getting to your largemouth bass. So having crappie in your pond can come at the cost of having fewer largemouth bass in your pond. And it really just depends on your goals. A lot of people really like to manage for largemouth bass in their pond. Some folks might even want to manage for trophy bass, really large size bass, and crappie can make that a little bit more difficult to do. The smaller your pond is, the greater the risk that crappie will overpopulate and make it really hard to have any other species in your pond, any other fish species like bluegill or largemouth bass. Okay, who are our other culprits on this slide here? We have golden shiner. So this is actually a really large minnow species. They're really pretty. They have this, really pretty, almost shimmery body, and so that's where they get their common name from. They're actually one of the most widely produced bait and forage fish species um, produced here in the United States. Some pond owners will stock golden shiner as an additional forage option for their bass. So I kind of hinted at this earlier. When you're managing a fish pond, you're really managing an ecosystem, and you really want to be thinking about your predator-prey dynamics. And any new character that you introduce to your character list here, our list of fish species, is going to be taking in food in some way, and that's going to remove nutrients from somebody else. So golden shiner is no exception to that. So yeah, they can compete for food. They're usually not sustainable in ponds containing bass because they'll get picked off by the bass. So you'll have to keep stocking them, which can be expensive. So just something to think about here. It can take about 4 to 5 pounds of forage fish to produce 1 pound of bass. So if that forage fish is bluegill, you're going to need 4 or 5 pounds of bluegill for every pound of bass you want to produce. So, it's possible you might want to supplement that forage fish base by adding golden shiner, but just keep in mind that they'll also compete with bass and bluegill for food. And then the third fish species I have shown on here are fathead minnow. Fathead minnows are often recommended for supplemental forage for newly stocked largemouth bass. We're just adding another food source for our largemouth bass. Fathead minnow, they're readily preyed upon by bass. They'll readily eat fathead minnow, and they might provide an initial boost to growth, but they're typically eaten before they can reproduce. So it makes it really hard for them to establish a self-sustaining population, which just means that you're going to have to continue stocking them, which costs money and it takes more effort. So if you're thinking about the easiest path to developing a self-sustaining pond, it's with bluegill and largemouth bass, but it's possible you might want to introduce some of these other species for various reasons, for example, to increase the forage options available to largemouth. There are other species that people will stock in their fish ponds, but these are some of the other common ones that come up. So I just wanted to mention them here. All right, so let's say you've got your pond, water quality is looking good. We have nice vegetation. Hopefully you've planted some native plants around that pond because they're going to be the easiest to maintain there and might have additional benefits for local pollinators. Let's say you've stocked your fish. Now we're ready for some longer term management. So what does that look like? Really, one of the most important tools in your toolkit for managing your pond is fish harvest. And proper fish harvest, once your pond has become established, the most common mistake a pond owner can make is under harvesting bass. If you don't harvest your bass, they're just going to keep feeding on your forage fish, your bluegill, and they might eventually overrun your bluegill or be in direct competition with each other so that you can't really get a lot of big bass. So again, this is really your ecosystem where you're managing your predator-prey dynamics, and taking out some fish, including those largemouth, is a really important piece of that plan, that management plan. So as I mentioned for largemouth bass, you really want to wait until they're about 12 to 14 inches in length before you start removing them from your pond. And again, that will normally happen after about 2 to 3 years. So if you start to harvest bass before that time, you really run the risk of over harvesting bass in your pond. And in that case, it can ruin a pond before it becomes established. So those first few years are really critical years for establishing a balance in your pond, and I'll talk about what I mean by balance in a couple slides here. And so you really want to make sure that your pond, your forage fish species, your bluegill, and your predator fish species, your largemouth, are established before you start removing fish. But once they are established, it is important that you do remove fish through harvest. Just to talk about that a little bit more, largemouth bass, when they're less than 12 inches, they're really aggressive feeders, and they'll help maintain that balance between, your bass and your sunfish, your bluegill. But and so practicing strict catch and release once those bass get a little bigger can be really important. And then as those bass get bigger, towards that 2 to 3 year age, um, then you want to start doing some harvesting. And a general rule of thumb is this: you can usually harvest about 10 to 20 bass per acre per year for bass that are 10 to 12 inches long. So for anyone taking notes, I'll just say that again because I know me when I'm trying to get numbers written down really quickly. Usually you'll want to harvest 10 to 20 bass per acre per year for bass that are 10 to 12 inches long. And that can be a good rule of thumb for helping to maintain a good pond balance. The other thing I want to say about fish harvest is you really want to spread that harvest throughout the fishing season. If you hit your pond really hard early in the year, let's say May, June, you're inviting a bunch of friends and family over, you want to have, a big weekend with lots of fishing happening, and you hit your max amount of bass that you want to take out for the whole year, that runs the risk of throwing your pond out of balance. So it can be better to spread out that harvest over a longer period of time so that you have a better risk, a better chance of buffering the effects of that harvest on your populations. Okay, what else? Let's talk now about bluegill. So we just talked about harvesting those nice largemouth bass. What to do with the bluegill? I mentioned that they are highly reproductive, which is good because we want enough forage fish species, enough prey for our bass to feed on. And so as a general rule, you can remove about 40 pounds of bluegill per acre annually from your pond. If you add fertilizer to your pond, meaning you can support a much larger food web with a broader base, so more fish, then you can probably double that and remove about 80 pounds of bluegill each year per acre. So if you think about if you've ever caught a bluegill before, you might be lucky to get a pound-sized fish. So that's a lot of fish that you can remove over the course of a year. Most complaints about poor fishing in a pond stem from overcrowded bluegill populations in the pond. And that can throw a pond out of balance. And the best way to prevent these problems is to fish the pond properly. It is a lot easier to prevent a pond from getting out of balance than to try to restore balance in an out of balance pond, meaning you have way too many largemouth and not enough prey or way too many prey and not enough largemouth. We want to try to avoid that from the get-go. And I'll just say here, I just threw some numbers at you about um, harvest counts for largemouth bass and for bluegill. Private ponds are not regulated by the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission because it's essentially your own, presumably, hopefully, self-contained community. So rules that apply to harvesting wild fish outside of a pond don't apply to your private pond. So I just wanted to mention that here. All right, so I've been using this term balance. What do I mean by that? A balanced pond is a pond that has a healthy ratio of predator and prey fish. And here I'm showing a really nice sample where we have lots of largemouth bass in here. So I'm just gonna point out the bass in this picture here. So here we see a lot of bass, here, got a couple more bass here. So we have a really nice ratio of predator fish and prey fish. So here's our bluegill here. See these dark-bodied bluegill here and here. And it's not just that we have largemouth bass and bluegill present. We also have different size classes and age classes of each species. So this is a really nice example here because we've got some really large largemouth, we've got some medium-sized largemouth. Our sunfish, our bluegill are a little less diverse in size, but this actually in general looks okay to me. And this balance is really important because you want to make sure you have enough young fish that can grow to maturity, and you want enough larger fish that can feed on those smaller fish so the population stays productive without becoming dominated by any one species. That's what we're talking about with pond balance. The other thing, oh, okay, I'll come to this later. So how do we determine?
Nadia, I
Yeah,
apologize for interrupting. We do want
sure.
to start wrapping up in about 2 minutes.
Okay, sounds good.
Awesome.
I'll just
Thank
talk
you.
about, thanks, Katie. I'll talk about a couple ways to determine pond balance. You can do that by keeping track of the number of fish that you harvest every year. That can be as simple as just having a notepad where you keep track of the number of bluegill largemouth bass you harvest every year. Our NC State Extension has these really handy tables, just like our fish stocking tables, that you can use to think about what you're seeing in your fish harvest and using that information to determine if your pond is out of balance. So, for example, if you're catching mostly small bluegill, it can be that you have an unbalanced population with bluegill overcrowding, which means you'd want to remove some of those bluegill. The other way that you can determine your pond balance, besides from what you catch with your hook and line angling, is by getting a cheap seine net. So I'm showing a seine net here with a 1/4 inch mesh on it, and you can catch fish near the shoreline in your seine net, pull that up, and see what you're looking at. And this is a really good way to look at small fish in particular. So here we have some small fingerling size largemouth and bluegill. And again, we have tables through NC State Extension that you can use to make an assessment of whether your population is in balance or not based on what comes up in that seine hall. And then the last thing I'll say about determining balance is if you want, you can always contract a private pond management company. There's lots in Wake County. There's lots across the state of North Carolina who can come out and do that for you. And they might also, if you have a big pond, bring out a fancy shocking boat to do some electrofishing for assessment as well. All right. For the sake of time, I'm just going to talk real briefly about a couple other things. Fish habitat is really important. You can really just add a structure. Could be, so here's an anchored tree that the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission put into one of our reservoirs around the state. It could be some other structure, submersing your Christmas tree. You can buy artificial plastic trees. Habitat can be really important to your pond. Um, One other thing I'll talk about briefly, just because it came up before, is fertilization. Fertilizing can be helpful for increasing, the capacity of your pond by adding more nutrients. We can support maybe more fish. But if you have an aquatic weed problem in your pond, adding more nutrients is just going to make it much, much worse. And so in that case, it'd be better not to fertilize at all. So that's something to think about. Aeration is another thing you can think about. you don't have to aerate your pond, but it's never going to hurt your pond to aerate it. And it can only help improve your water quality by making sure oxygen is getting mixed evenly throughout your water column. Okay, so hopefully I was able to interest some of you in maintaining a pond, getting access to a pond. It really can open up a whole lot of fun from a recreational angling perspective. Everything I talked about is in our NC State Extension Pond Management Guide. I've attached a screenshot here of the cover of the guide. You can also find it at the link that I've shown here, this QR code, so feel free to scan that. And then I'm also going to include my email address here, so you can always feel free to reach out with any questions. If you own a pond or have a friend or family member that owns a pond and has some kind of question about how to stock it, feel free to reach out with any questions you might have. All right, so with that, I'll wrap us up, and I think we have some time for questions. Is that right, Katie?
Yes, it is. All right. Thank you so much, Nadia. So if you guys have any questions for her, please feel free to put them in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask them out loud. There's also a raised hand feature. So if you look up at the top of Teams, there's like a pop out, smiley face, and in between those, there's a little raise hand. So you can use that as well. Nadia, if you want to go ahead and stop your screen share.
Sure.
Oh,
There we
great. That just
go.
makes it a little bit easier to see if people do want to, for whatever people want to do. All right. So the floor is open for any questions that you guys have over the next handful of minutes here.
And I'll say too, for anyone thinking of a question, if it's not something that comes to mind now, but comes to mind down the road, you can always feel free to reach out to me or anyone really in our at NC State Extension, and they'll try to direct you to the right person that has expertise in this area.
Yeah, and I'll also, if it's all right with you, Nadia, I send up a follow-up email. I'll be sending one hopefully later this week, with the recording of the lecture, signed EE forms, and I can include your email as well and any other resources that you might want me to share with the group.
Sure, that sounds great. Thanks, Katie.
Yeah. So I had a question. I was personally surprised by the size requirement for a fishing pond, because I have seen fish ponds that are smaller than that. So
Yeah.
is it possible to have a healthy fish pond if it is smaller than an acre?
Yeah, it is possible. I mean, that acre and larger recommendation, it's a recommendation. I've also seen smaller ponds that support healthy fish populations, so it's definitely feasible. One thing to think about too is the location of your pond relative to, say, ag fields, because you might not be fertilizing your pond, but your neighbors might be fertilizing their property. And when a rainstorm comes along, that can introduce nutrients into your pond. And so a smaller pond can be more susceptible to aquatic weed takeover
Mm,
in general, but also because of, excessive nutrients, for example, due to fertilization or fertilizer runoff. So it's just something to think about, but it doesn't mean that you can't have a fun fishing pond on a smaller
okay.
area.
And then kind of is related to my next question, and you may have answered this already, so I do apologize if this is a repeat. But what's then the threshold of pond to lake? Because if I saw an acre-size body of water, I'd be like,
Mm,
that's a lake.
that is a great question. And I actually don't know if there's any hard or fast rules. I was just looking at something the other day that was focused on a very large pond that I would have called a lake. And, I think I don't, yeah, I guess long answer short, I don't know if there's a hard and fast rule out there. There might be. But, I've been on ponds that are several acres
Wow.
large that really look like a small lake. So a lot of the management principles that I just talked about for ponds still apply when you're talking about a small lake or other type of impoundment. So, yeah.
Okay, because now I'm like, does Lake Johnson count as a lake then?
That is a great
It has some like
question.
te and it has some of the like qualities that you're talking about with like warm water ponds because
Yeah.
it's really not that deep. either.
Right.
So,
What do you
yeah.
know the average depth of Lake Johnson?
I don't, but I know there's a lot of areas where it is definitely less than 10 to 12 feet.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if many of the dynamics that you'd want to think about there are really on par with what I shared here.
Hmm, it's fascinating.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I don't know that there are any other questions, which just means you did a great job of thoroughly covering the subject. If y'all think of any, again, please feel free to email Nadja directly, or you can email me, and I will pass them on to her. Again, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Nadja, thank you for presenting. As I mentioned just a minute ago, if you are seeking EE credit, you'll receive a follow-up email later in the week with an attached form. I'll also make this recording available on our Environmental Lecture Series YouTube playlist, and you'll receive a link to that as well in the email. We hope to see you at our next lecture. So let me actually I completely forgot to pull up my list of speakers. Let me pull that up now for you guys. Our next lecture is November 10th, 7 to 8 p.m. Kyra Thuro Barto from Piedmont Wildlife Center will be doing a Birding Unlimited lecture. So talking a lot about the joys of birding, highlight some movements that make birding more inclusive, such as stationary outings, big sits, car birding, and birding by ear. So I hope you guys will join us next time for that. You guys have a great night and hope to see you soon.
Thank
Thanks,
you. Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.